All right, this is chapter 7. Let me know how the sound is. I got the Pro Gamer set up here. I don't have the chair with the you know, sides on it for whatever G-forces or whatever gamers experience when they're sitting in their chairs gaming, but I got the headphones, so let me know how it sounds, if it sounds good or not. Um, I made this for you. Um, a little harsh on Hamilton, but I would expect nothing less from Thomas Jefferson. Okay, so let's go through this. This is a pretty quick one, but it's important to go over the Hamilton's plan and then the kind of precedents that are set by Washington. So let's start with that. Um, Washington is, as you might know, the first president. He serves 2 terms. So what's happening here is that for Washington, look, the United States had a revolution, but they're still inheriting a lot of English tradition. And one of the things that they're inheriting is this idea of customary law. So things that aren't necessarily written down, but because if you do them for long enough time, it kind of just is law, right? You just do it. And Washington understands this, that he is setting precedent with everything he does. It's a precedent, right? That later presidents will have to follow. So obviously the most famous one is the 2 terms in office. He serves twice and then steps down. And that is the model for all later presidents until Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who serves 4 times, but more on that when we get there. The other precedent that is set here is the precedent of executive privilege. Our chapter talks about the Jay Treaty, controversial treaty. The House wants to see it. The House wants to see the documents that were involved in the negotiation. And Washington looks at the Constitution and he says the Senate is the body that ratifies treaties, not the House. So I don't have to give you this. And he cites executive privilege, right? That certain things the president does, says, whatever, don't need to be given to people who don't need to see it. So again, this is another very important precedent that is set by the Washington administration. Aside from that, you have in the cabinet, you've got TJ as the Secretary of State. He's an anti-federalist. You've got Hamilton. I mean, come on, you all know this by now, right? Hamilton is the Secretary of Treasury. He's a federalist. Henry Knox, we've read about and heard about, right? In the 50-word sentence, there was a letter from Washington to Henry Knox about Shays' Rebellion. So he's the Secretary of War. And then Edmund Randolph, another Virginian, is the Attorney General. So the division between Hamilton and Jefferson is really the beginning of a larger conflict between what will be known as the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, or the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. It's not just these 2 guys; they just are the most famous advocates of 2 differing ways of thinking about the United States government, right? One that puts more power in the federal government, and one that puts more power in the states. And so let's learn about Hamilton's thing. So Hamilton, he is what you would call a dirigist or dirigisme. It's a French term that basically means state capitalism, right? So he's not a free market capitalist. He's not saying that the government should play a regulatory role either. He's saying that the government should have a hand in effectively planning the economy, supporting the economy. So what modern political economists or political scientists would call state capitalism, right? Lots of examples of this. We can argue about where they are, but any place where the government has a heavy hand in directing industry, supporting industry, that's state capitalism. So again, not free market, not just the government is there to regulate, the government has an active role in planning the economy. That's Hamilton's kind of thing. So where does he come up with his ideas? The Constitution. But he has what is called a loose interpretation of the Constitution. So this is the idea of implied powers. Yeah, it doesn't say it, but it kind of says it, right? So it doesn't need to be the exact letter of the law. If it says that, that the government can regulate commerce. Well, what does that mean, right? A loose interpretation means it can do all kinds of things, right? Make trade treaties, pass excise taxes and tariffs, sign agreements with other countries, right? A loose interpretation is that, right, this idea that you have implied powers. The Constitution might not say it exactly, but you have implied powers because there's nowhere in the Constitution that says he can do any of this stuff, right? So this idea of implied powers. This is an important concept. The kind of American school is Hamilton's idea. It's going to be with us for a very long time. It'll come back again in the 1830s with the Whigs. Henry Clay comes up with a new version of this. Okay, so what is the American school? First, tariffs on imports. Right, so this is to help protect domestic manufacturing. That's to say, what is a tariff? A tariff means that if you make, this mouse in the United States, it costs you X amount of dollars. If this mouse is made in Germany and imported here, there's a tariff on it, makes it more expensive so that the American mouse manufacturer can compete, right? The German product becomes more expensive, then it kind of can help even out the competition. So tariffs. He also supports excise taxes. So in the past, we haven't really differentiated between these two, but effectively a tariff is a tax on things coming into a country, right? So it's international taxes, where an excise tax is intra-national, so within a country. So the Whiskey Rebellion is about an excise tax, right? Because it's about a tax on whiskey being made in the United States. Okay. So that's one. Tariffs and imports. Direct subsidies for domestic manufacturing. So again, this is to help nascent manufacturing, right? Emerging manufacturing in the United States. How is it going to compete with England, right? Remember, the mercantile system means that all of that manufacturing is in England, right? That the idea of the colonies was that was a place for the resources to be sent to England, manufactured, and then sent back to the colonies. So there's no way that they compete with England unless they have tariffs that make it, prohibitively expensive to buy the English thing, or direct subsidies on domestic manufacturing. Public bank, right? This is the most famous thing, partially public owned national bank. So it's partially public owned, partially private owned. The idea, of course, being this is going to stabilize the economy. It's going to help pay debt. It can print currency, right? Paper money. Remember in the last lecture, I talked about the difference between fiat and specie, right? Gold and silver is specie. Fiat is paper money, so it can print paper money. All these things are good if you want to get the economy going. And then it can invest in infrastructure, right? Build roads, build canals. We don't really have railroads yet, but that would be an example of infrastructure, so that this is going to help facilitate commerce. And all of these things, again, in Hamilton's implied powers, the loose interpretation of the Constitution says you can do all of this stuff, right? Okay, that's his thing. What is the Democratic Republican response? They don't agree, right? They have a strict interpretation of the Constitution. If it doesn't say it, you can't do it. Now, this will be ironic once Jefferson becomes president, because there's no place in the Constitution that says he can buy, right, like the Louisiana Purchase. So the tune changes once he gets in office. But for now, he's not the president. He's just the Secretary of State, and he believes in a strict interpretation of the Constitution. Along with him are people like Madison, Southerners in general, and then rural Northerners also. And that varies depending on where they're at and what they do. So they say Hamilton wants to place too much power in the federal government. The whole idea of the American Revolution was not to have a strong centralized government, right? That was the problem with the king. That was the reason they liked the Articles of Confederation. Now they see this kind of trending, and especially because it's Hamilton. I mean, Hamilton at the Constitutional Convention, he suggests a structure of government that's basically a monarchy, right? Unlimited powers, lifetime terms for an executive, and he gets right. They don't even debate it, right? So like the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan, all of that stuff, Connecticut Compromise, Hamilton's plan, they don't even debate it. It's just like crazy. And charges of him being a monarchist follow him around his whole life for that reason. So anyway, there's a reason why Jefferson and them are a little suspect of Hamilton's motives. They also, not just pure paranoia, they think that this is a scheme that's just going to benefit bankers, northern merchants, industrialists, and it's not going to help the vast majority of American people. It's just going to get rich people, rich Federalists, richer, right? So they don't think that this is, again, this is a very important point, that their understanding of what the Republic is about democracy. And for them and for anyone, right, it's important to remember that democracy is not the same thing as capitalism. Democracy and capitalism are two different things. So for Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, they're very suspicious of this financial system and economic system that potentially is going to benefit certain people over other people. And of course, there's, right, we can point out the ironies, we can talk about the contradictions, of course, right? These are people who are enslavers, bad people, etc. Okay, so financially, they'd prefer to have the money in local banks as opposed to a federal bank. We'll see this later with Andrew Jackson, famously, right? He ends the national bank after its 20-year run. Okay, so again, look at the big picture and then look at the underlying currents of conflict here, because these underlying currents are going to come back in different ways in different historical time periods. Okay, Federalist versus Anti-Federalist, we get it, right? But this is also a question of a group of people that is okay with an aristocracy having more power, and a group of people who are not okay with that and want to have more power in the hands of the demos, right, or the people, right, democracy. It's about merchants versus farmers. The interests of merchants in the Northeast are different from those of rural farmers. And very importantly, it's the difference between people who say the Constitution is the most important document for this government, and people who say the Declaration of Independence is the most important document. And what that means is the Constitution guarantees basic rights, right? Property rights, contract rights, all kinds of rights that are going to help the law work in certain ways, right, and favor certain people. The Declaration of Independence is a radical document. It's about revolution. It's about everyone being equal. So that's why, as your book points out, when the Democratic Republicans go marching around celebrating, they're celebrating the 4th of July, they're celebrating the Declaration of Independence, because that's the radical document. The Constitution is not radical, right? The Constitution helps ensure slave owners to have more power over the enslaved. It has the slave trade. It has the Fugitive Slave Act. I mean, all of these kind of things that are not about equality. Anyway, these conflicts are very, very important, and we're going to see them come up again and again and again. Okay, French Revolution happens. On the one hand, there's some good stuff. Monarchy's bad, republic good. The French helped the Americans in the Revolution, so that's good. Jefferson is a big fan of the French Revolution. On the other hand, right, the United States has a treaty with the monarch. The monarch's dead, right? So that's not good. They're worried about England. If they support France, then what does England do? Obviously, they don't want to go to war with England again. And generally, the Federalists don't like it. Federalists are pro-England. Anti-Federalists are pro-France. Right, so that's another important distinction between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. What do they do in the end? Proclamation of Neutrality, 1793. It's not popular. Right, a lot of Americans want to go in and help. They see, right, democracy is spreading. It's not a good idea, and it's a smart move in the end on Washington's part that they did that. Haitian Revolution also happening at this time, 1791. The same time as the French Revolution. Haitian Revolution begins, led by Toussaint Louverture. It is the most successful slave rebellion in history. They beat the French, they beat the English, they beat the Spanish, and establish a free republic, right, in the New World, along with the United States. It is not recognized by Europe or the United States. France makes sure that other countries will not trade with Haiti. Haiti is the most profitable and rich colony in the whole New World before the Revolution, and because of French policy after the Revolution, it becomes one of the poorest nations in the New World. They are made to pay a debt to the loss of property, right? Property here being largely human beings, and they don't pay that debt off until the 1940s. So why am I talking about Haiti? One, because it's another revolution in the spirit of the American Revolution, but very, very different in that, as I said, American Revolution, the lowest rungs of society get lower. Native Americans, enslaved Africans, right? They're worse off after the revolution. Here you have a revolution where the worse off are better, right? They're running the country, right? It's their nation. And it's also relevant because it's part of the reason why the Louisiana Purchase will happen. Is because they don't need, France won't need that territory anymore because they don't have Haiti. I'll explain more on that in the next part of the lecture. I include this old meme. It's a French Revolution meme. It's not relevant to our purposes here, but it is. Actually last year I accidentally sent it to all of the. Wanted to send it to me, and I sent it to all the faculty, and I immediately got a bunch of email responses back saying, "What? Why did you send this to everyone?" So anyway. Jacobin joke. Okay, John Adams, 1797 to 1801. He's a Federalist, so this is the next guy in charge. Washington, 2 terms, right? He steps down. Adams wins. He's the second president of the United States. XYZ affair, who cares? It's only relevant because it is a bribery scandal and it makes Americans, some Americans, not like France. Right, French officials want to bribe the American officials before they negotiate. Right, so it's kind of an anti-French sentiment is on the rise. Again, Federalists don't like the French to begin with, so they pass acts that target both French Americans and the Democratic Republicans or anti-Federalists. The Alien and Sedition Acts, these are the first anti-immigrant pieces of legislation in American history, so a long tradition of anti-immigrant legislation. We'll see this again and again. And this targets the French, newly arrived French immigrants. Thomas Jefferson doesn't like it. The Federalists don't like it. The Naturalization Act changes citizenship laws from 5 to 14 years. Newly arrived immigrants are more likely to vote for Democratic Republicans. So this, again, disenfranchises people who are likely to vote for the other side. And then the Alien Act, right, allows for easier deportation of aliens here, people who are not yet citizens. And then the Sedition Act is about censoring newspapers. Not a good look, right? So all of these things are definitely not a good look. When you look at here, we're not very far out of the revolutionary period when a lot of this stuff is precisely the reason they had a revolution in the first place, especially the censorship, right? So these are not popular with a lot of people, and the Democratic Republicans respond. They know, in particular, the Sedition Act, they know that it violates the First Amendment. There's just no question that it violates the First Amendment. This is the problem. There's no process of judicial review yet. So nowadays, unconstitutional law gets passed, goes to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court says it's unconstitutional, gets thrown out, can't do it anymore, right? That hasn't been established yet, right? So the idea that the Supreme Court is actually the ultimate arbiter of what is constitutional or not constitutional, that doesn't happen until 1803. More on that in the next lecture, right? So for this, they know it's unconstitutional, but they can't do anything. What do? They tap into their anti-federalist ideology and they write about it. They argue that these laws are unconstitutional and that the states, right, this is the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. They argue that the states have the right to nullify laws that go against local state law, right? So if the federal government passes a law that goes against state law, they can nullify that law, not abide by that law. It's basically just a political document, a kind of think piece in 1799, but obviously this is very important for later regional conflicts and other nullification crises, right? So South Carolina will get up in their feelings in the 1820s, and then obviously South Carolina again in the 1860s with the Civil War will cite the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions as justification for eventually seceding from the Union. People don't like John Adams. Jefferson defeats Adams in 1800. It's called the Revolution of 1800, right? Because it's a return, as Jefferson would argue, a return to what he would call first principles, right? The actual vision of the founders. It also marks a very important point in American history, the peaceful transition of power. That is to say, when someone loses an election, they don't contest it, they don't call up the military, they don't refuse to leave, they don't invalidate the vote. They say, okay, fair is fair, and you won and I lost, and they leave office. The peaceful transition of power is a very important part of American political tradition. And here's the first time it happens in 1800. So to be continued.